Imagine, if you will, the spring of 1944. The world is held in a state of agonizing breath. Across the English Channel, the most formidable defensive line in history, Hitler's Atlantic Wall, stands like a jagged row of teeth, waiting to tear the heart out of any invasion force. To the German High Command, the math of war was immutable. An army, no matter how brave, is a biological machine that runs on oil, steel, and calories. Thousands of tons of it, every single day. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, a master of desert logistics, understood this better than anyone. He looked at the French coast and saw a fortress. He knew that for the Allies to succeed, they didn't just need to land men, they needed to feed them. And you cannot feed an army through the surf of a shifting tide. You need a deep-water port. You need cranes, docks, and sheltered water. Without these, any landing force would be nothing more than a temporary nuisance, a group of men waiting to be pushed back into the sea as soon as their ammunition ran dry. The Germans had spent years turning every harbor from Cherbourg to Le Havre into a concrete nightmare. They were certain, no port, no victory. But in the dim light of the London war rooms, Winston Churchill was contemplating a defiance of geography itself. He knew the history of failed invasions. He knew that attacking a fortified harbor was a death sentence for the thousands who would lead the charge. The memory of the slaughter at Dieppe in 1942 hung over the planners like a cold, wet shroud. It was there that the Allies learned that a port could not be taken from the sea. And so, a question was asked that seemed to border on insanity. If we cannot capture a port, why don't we simply build one ourselves and take it with us? The idea was so radical, so massive in its defiance of naval tradition, that it was met with open derision by many. To build a harbor in the safety of England? To tow it across the most treacherous stretch of water in Europe? And to assemble it under the guns of the enemy? It was a plan that required not just engineers, but visionaries who were willing to gamble the fate of Western civilization on the buoyancy of concrete. Churchill's directive was legendary in its brevity. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. And thus, the Mulberry Project was born. A secret so large, it had to be hidden in plain sight. In the hidden estuaries of the Thames, in the remote, foggy lochs of Scotland, a silent army of 45,000 workers began to pour concrete into the shapes of giants. These were the Phoenix caissons, monolithic, hollow boxes of reinforced steel and stone. One was a gargantuan feat of engineering, some weighing over 6,000 tons and standing 60 feet tall. The sheer volume of material was staggering. In a Britain already starved of resources, every bag of cement, every rod of steel was diverted to these nameless gray monsters. The workers themselves often didn't know the true purpose of their labor. They were building sections of a puzzle, a modular harbor that would eventually stretch for miles. German reconnaissance aircraft frequently flew high above, their cameras clicking. But the Abwehr analysts in Berlin were paralyzed by their own rigid logic. They saw the construction, they saw the gray shadows in the water, but they could not conceive of a portable port. They assumed these were perhaps massive anti-aircraft platforms, or perhaps a desperate British attempt to build underwater shelters. The secret held not because it was hidden, but because the scale of the ambition was simply too vast for the German mind to accept. The construction was a race against a clock that was ticking toward a day no one could name, but everyone knew was coming. These Phoenix caissons were accompanied by miles of flexible steel roadways, nicknamed whales, and hundreds of pontoon beetles. This was modular warfare before the term existed. Each piece had to be built with a tolerance that would allow it to be snapped together in the chaos of a storm-tossed sea. As the spring of 1944 turned into summer, the British coast was lined with these gray shapes, bobbing in the tide like a ghost armada. The industrial might of a nation was concentrated on this one goal. Every weld had to hold, every valve had to function. If a single caisson failed, if it cracked under the pressure of the deep or leaked before it was scuttled, it could create a gap in the logistics chain that would cost thousands of lives. The atmosphere was one of quiet, intense desperation. These were the keys to the doorway of Europe, and as the tides began to align for the month of June, the orders were cut. The giants were ready to wake up. The concrete was ready to go to war. This was the silent phase of D-Day, the phase where the engineers and the bricklayers were just as important as the paratroopers. On the morning of June 7th, while the echoes of the initial bombardment were still vibrating through the soil of Normandy, a second, stranger invasion began. It was the slowest armada in the history of naval warfare. A fleet of 160 tugboats, some of them veteran ocean-goers and others barely more than harbor scows, began to haul the Phoenix caissons out into the open water of the English Channel. The speed was a grueling 4 knots, barely more than a walking pace. To the men on the tugs, it was a journey of pure terror. These concrete monoliths had the aerodynamic properties of a cliff face and the maneuverability of a mountain. They were wallowing in the swells, straining at the thick hemp hawsers that bound them to the tugs. If the wind picked up, if a sudden squall hit, the caissons could easily drag the tugs under or snap the lines and wander off into the darkness as unguided hazards. The channel, notorious for its temper, seemed to sense the intrusion. The water was a restless, churning black, and the gray sky offered no comfort. Every mile gained was a victory of sheer stubbornness over the elements. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Had a single pack of German E-boats or U-boats broken through the Allied screen, they wouldn't have found a fleet of warships ready to fire back. They would have found a sitting duck made of concrete. But the German response was curiously absent, muffled by the sheer chaos of the landings elsewhere. And so the concrete giants continued their silent march. From the cliffs of Normandy, German sentries who had survived the initial hell of D-Day looked out and saw a sight that challenged their sanity. Through the morning mist, they didn't just see the steel silhouettes of the Royal Navy. They saw massive, gray, flat-topped islands appearing on the horizon, moving with a slow, deliberate purpose toward the Arromanches coastline. It looked like a city was migrating. These were the building blocks of Port Winston. The Germans had spent years preparing for an enemy that would try to take their ports, but they had no plan for an enemy that brought its own. This was a psychological blow that hit as hard as any shell. It was a realization that the Allies were not just visiting, they were moving in. They were changing the very shape of the coastline to suit their needs. As the tugs reached their designated drop zones, the next phase began, a phase of destructive construction. The caissons were positioned, the sea valves were manned, and the engineers prepared to commit these massive structures to the seabed. The drama of the Mulberry was about to move from the surface of the water to the floor of the ocean. The placement of the caissons was a dance of destruction and precision. As each tug released its tow, Royal Engineers scrambled onto the tops of the Phoenix blocks. Beneath their feet, the sea valves were opened. This was the moment of no return. As the air hissed out of the hollow chambers, the 6,000-ton blocks began to settle into the restless water. It was a violent, groaning process. The concrete would tilt and shudder as the weight of the Atlantic began to fill its interior. The goal was to place them with inches of precision, to create a continuous semicircular breakwater that would stretch for miles. If a single block drifted or settled unevenly on a hidden sandbar, it could compromise the entire structural integrity of the harbor. The engineers worked with a feverish intensity, knowing that every minute they spent scuttling these blocks was a minute they were exposed to German coastal batteries. The sound was a symphony of rushing water and clanging metal, a mechanical birth on the floor of the English Channel. As the blocks reached the seabed, they stood as silent, submerged sentinels, their tops barely visible above the high tide, ready to break the back of the first storm that dared to challenge them. Within a mere 72 hours, the transformation of the Arromanches coastline was complete. What had been a treacherous open bay was now sheltered water, as calm as a lake in the middle of a war zone. The Phoenix breakwaters had successfully tamed the sea. Outside, the channel continued to churn and roar, but inside the perimeter of the Mulberry, the water was flat and inviting. This was the true miracle of Port Winston. It was a sanctuary of logistics. German artillery officers, observing from the high ground at Lons-sur-Mer, were baffled. They fired their shells, but hitting a submerged concrete block was a futile exercise. They were witnessing the systematic construction of a terminal that would soon bypass every fortification they had spent years building. The foundation was set. The doorway was open. Now, the Allies just had to build the bridge that would carry the weight of an empire into the heart of France. The silence of the sinking was replaced by the deafening roar of industrial progress as the first of the floating roadways began to stretch their long steel fingers toward the sand. Now came the whales, the ingenious floating roadways that would bridge the gap between the deep-water ships and the shallow shore. These were not mere docks, they were flexible, steel-ribbed highways designed to survive the brutal vertical movement of the Normandy tides, which could swing as much as 24 feet in a single day. Each section of the roadway was mounted on beetles, pontoons made of steel or concrete that allowed the entire structure to rise and fall like a living thing. To watch them in action was to witness a triumph of mechanical design over the chaotic forces of nature. As the tide rolled in, the roads lifted. As it ebbed, they settled. This meant that the flow of supplies never had to stop. The conveyor belt of war was now operational. Thousands of trucks, ambulances, and tanks could now roll off the ships and onto the French soil without ever getting their tires wet. It was a logistical umbilical cord that could not be severed by anything short of a direct hit from a battleship. The Germans, who relied on the limitations of the tide to dictate the pace of the war, found themselves facing an enemy that had simply engineered the tide out of the equation. The sheer scale of the operation at Port Winston was staggering to the human eye. By D-Day +5, the whale roadways stretched for over a mile into the sea. This was a highway built on waves, a testament to the industrial power of the United States and Britain combined. The sound of thousands of engines humming across these steel bridges became the constant background noise of the invasion. It was a mechanical heartbeat. Every truck that rumbled onto the sand carried the ammunition for a battery, the fuel for a panzer-crushing Sherman, or the food for a hungry platoon. The Germans in the hedgerows of the bocage began to notice a terrifying change. The Americans and British weren't running out of shells, they were firing more. Their tanks weren't stalling for lack of fuel, they were pushing harder. This was the work of the Mulberry. It turned the Normandy beachhead from a precarious foothold into a massive industrial-scale terminal. The whales were the arteries of the liberation, pumping the lifeblood of an industrial civilization into a continent that had been choked by the darkness of the Third Reich for 4 long years. But on the 19th of June, 1944, the sea decided to take its revenge. The worst summer storm in 40 years roared into the English Channel, catching the Allies completely off guard. For 3 terrifying days, a gale-force wind from the northeast lashed the Normandy coast with a fury that no engineer had planned for. The Mulberry harbors, those miracles of concrete and steel, were suddenly fighting for their lives. The American Mulberry at Omaha Beach, more exposed and less reinforced than its British counterpart, began to disintegrate under the mountainous waves. Massive Phoenix caissons, designed to withstand the sea, were lifted and smashed like toys. Floating roadways were twisted into knots of jagged steel, and over 800 Allied vessels were driven onto the rocks or swamped by the surf. It was a catastrophe of nearly biblical proportions. As the planners in London watched the weather reports in horror, it seemed as though the Atlantic Ocean was doing what the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht could not. It was cutting the Allied throat. The invasion was on the verge of stalling, leaving the men inland isolated and vulnerable to a German counteroffensive that could have changed the course of history. The aftermath of the Great Gale was a scene of industrial carnage. The American Mulberry was a total wreck, its debris littering the coastline for miles. However, the British Mulberry at Armitage, Port Winston, somehow held firm. Its more sheltered position and the desperate efforts of the men who manned it saved the project from total annihilation. This storm was the ultimate test of the Mulberry concept. While the Americans shifted back to landing supplies directly on the beach, the British doubled down on Port Winston. They salvaged what they could from the ruins of the Omaha Harbor and reinforced Armitage, turning it into the singular, vital lung of the Allied Army. The storm had proven that while man could engineer a harbor, he could never truly master the sea. But it also proved the resilience of the Allied spirit. They didn't retreat, they adapted. The heartbeat of Port Winston slowed, but it never stopped. As the skies finally cleared and the waves subsided, the conveyor belt began to move once again, even faster than before, as if to make up for the lost time and to prove to the world that no storm could stop the march of democracy. With the storm clouds gone, Port Winston reached its final, terrifyingly efficient form. It was no longer a temporary dock. It was the busiest port in the world. By July 1944, this artificial harbor was moving 11,000 tons of materiel every single day. To put that in perspective, that is the equivalent of a fully loaded freight train every few hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The logistics of the liberation were now an industrial science. Special signal towers were erected on the concrete caissons to manage the traffic of hundreds of ships. Deep water docks allowed the massive Liberty ships to offload their cargo directly into the hands of the waiting truck drivers. The Germans, whose own logistics were being systematically shredded by Allied air power, could only watch in a state of paralysis. They were fighting a war of scarcity, while the Allies were waging a war of abundance. Every shell fired by a German battery was a precious resource that couldn't easily be replaced. Every shell fired by the Allies was just one of millions waiting in the holds of the ships at Armitage. The Mulberry had created a strategic imbalance that made a German victory not just unlikely, but mathematically impossible. The human side of this industrial pulse was just as remarkable. Thousands of men lived and worked on the Mulberry itself, creating a city on the sea. There were floating kitchens, repair shops, and even rest areas for the exhausted crews. It was a triumph of the common man, the dock workers, the engineers, and the truck drivers who made the Red Ball Express possible. They were the unsung heroes of the Normandy campaign. As the summer heat intensified, the dust from the endless convoys coated the Norman villages in a gray shroud. But that dust was the smell of progress. It was the sound of the Third Reich being slowly ground into the dirt by the sheer weight of American and British production. Port Winston was the physical manifestation of the Allied promise. We will bring everything we have, and we will not stop until the job is done. By the time the port of Cherbourg was finally captured and cleared of mines, Port Winston had already landed enough supplies to sustain the entire liberation of France. It had served its purpose as the gateway to a continent, proving that in the 20th century, the side with the best logistics always has the last word. There's a chilling historical record of a group of high-ranking German officers captured during the breakout from Normandy, being driven past the Mulberry Harbor at Armitage. These were men who had been told by their propaganda ministry that the American industry was a myth, that the British were on the verge of starvation, and that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. As they looked out at the miles of concrete piers, the hundreds of ships docking simultaneously, and the mountains of supplies stretching as far as the eye could see, their world collapsed. One German colonel reportedly broke down in tears, realizing that his men had been fighting with horse-drawn wagons against an enemy that could manufacture a harbor and tow it across an ocean. This was the shock of reality that the Mulberry inflicted upon the German military mind. It wasn't just a defeat on the battlefield, it was a realization of total systemic inferiority. They weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting a civilization that could outthink, outbuild, and outsupply them at every turn. The tactical brilliance of the German soldier was rendered irrelevant by the industrial genius of the Allied engineer. This psychological devastation filtered down to the German rank and file. Prisoners of war being marched toward the beaches for transport to England were forced to walk through the logistical maze of Port Winston. They saw American soldiers eating fresh meat, smoking high-quality cigarettes, and driving vehicles that were brand new. They saw the whale bridges swaying under the weight of thousands of tanks that looked like they had just come off the assembly line, because they had. The contrast was brutal. The German army was surviving on looted rations and scavenged equipment, while the Allies were enjoying the fruits of a global supply chain that centered on this gray, concrete harbor. The Mulberry was the ultimate propaganda tool, but it was a propaganda of fact, not fiction. It told every German who saw it that the war was over, even if the fighting continued for another year. It proved that the Third Reich's dream of a 1,000-year empire was being dismantled by a temporary harbor that had been built in 6 months. The German officers realized that they weren't just losing a war of territory, they were losing a war of eras. The age of the fortress was dead, replaced by the age of the modular industrial machine. As the front line moved toward Paris and eventually the Rhine, the role of Port Winston began to shift, but its legacy was already cemented in the annals of history. The Mulberry was not just a wartime fluke, it was a blueprint for the future of civil engineering and global logistics. The concept of modular, prefabricated construction on a massive scale, which had been perfected in the estuaries of Britain, would go on to define the post-war reconstruction of Europe's shattered infrastructure. The technology used to create the whale roadways and the Phoenix caissons would later be adapted for offshore oil drilling, modern bridge building, and the development of massive container ports that now fuel our global economy. Engineers from around the world studied the data from Arromanches, marveling at how such complex structures could be assembled in such hostile conditions. The Mulberry Project proved that human innovation could overcome the most extreme environmental challenges through standardized design and industrial coordination. It was the birth of a new kind of engineering, one that prioritized flexibility and mobility over static, permanent structures, changing the way we build everything from seawalls to skyscrapers. But beyond the technical specifications, the legacy of the Mulberry harbors remains a profoundly human story of collaboration and ingenuity. It represents the collective effort of thousands of minds working toward a single, desperate goal. The project proved that the world's democracies could mobilize their intellectual and industrial resources with a speed and scale that the totalitarian regimes simply could not match. While Hitler invested his hopes in wonder weapons that were often erratic and impractical, the Allies invested in logistics, the quiet, unglamorous machinery of victory. The Mulberry Harbor showed that the true strength of a nation lies in its ability to solve problems, to build rather than just destroy. As the sections of the harbor were eventually dismantled or left to the elements, the spirit of innovation they represented stayed alive. They paved the way for the Marshall Plan and the economic miracle of the 1950s, reminding us that the same industrial power used to win a war could be used to build a lasting peace. The legacy of Arromanches is not found in the concrete alone, but in the realization that there is no obstacle too great for a free and determined people to overcome. Today, the beaches of Arromanches are silent. The roar of the trucks and the clanging of the cranes have long since faded into the mists of history. But if you stand on the cliffs at low tide and look out at the gray-blue waters of the channel, the ghosts of the Mulberry are still there. The rusted, barnacle-encrusted remains of the Phoenix caissons sit like ancient, fallen monuments in the surf. They are the skeletal remains of a miracle. These ruins serve as a permanent reminder of a time when the world's greatest democracies realized that to defeat a monster, they had to do something that had never been done before. They didn't just fight, they engineered their way to freedom. The Mulberry Harbor remains one of the most significant achievements in the history of human ingenuity, a testament to what can be accomplished when the collective brain power of a free people is focused on a singular, moral goal. It was the bridge that carried the light of liberty back into a darkened continent, a doorway that Hitler forgot to lock because he didn't believe it could be built. The concrete may be crumbling, but the freedom it secured remains the most enduring monument of the 20th century. As the sun sets over the Normandy coast, the shadows of the phoenix blocks grow long across the sand, reaching toward the shore where thousands of men once stepped into the fire of liberation. The story of the Mulberry is more than a story of logistics or engineering. It is a story of the human spirit's refusal to accept the impossible. It reminds us that no wall is truly impregnable if you have the imagination to bypass it, and no ocean is too wide if you have the courage to build a bridge. The men who designed, built, and manned these floating harbors have mostly passed into legend, but their work lives on in every free breath taken in Europe today. They turned a suicide mission into a triumph of industrial will. As the last of the rusted steel eventually dissolves into the salt water and the concrete finally returns to the seabed, the legacy of Port Winston will remain. It was the longest day's greatest secret, the harbor that walked across the sea, and the machine that broke the back of a tyranny. The tide will continue to rise and fall, but the world that was saved by these gray giants will never forget the day the Allies brought their own harbor to war.